Imagine you're shipwrecked off the coast of northwest Africa. You find yourself at the edge of the Sahara Desert, one of the most uninhabitable places on Earth. With dwindling supplies, you need to cross hundreds of miles to reach civilization. The all-new season of Against the Odds from Wondery tells the true story of Captain James Riley and his crew who survived a harrowing ordeal in their fight to get out of the desert. Listen to the podcast Against the Odds, Shipwreck on the Sahara on Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, or you can listen 1 week early and ad-free by joining Wondery Plus in the Wondery app. Wondery, feel the story. This Day in Esoteric Political History is brought to you by Progressive. Are you thinking about how to tighten up your budget these days? We all are. Drivers who save by switching to Progressive save over $700 on average, and customers can qualify for an average of 6 discounts when they sign up. A little off your rate each month goes a long way. Get a quote today at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. National annual average insurance savings by new customers surveyed in 2020. Potential savings will vary, discounts vary, and are not available in all states and situations. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. This day, July 18th, 2013, the city of Detroit filed for Chapter 9 bankruptcy, the largest municipal bankruptcy filing in U.S. history, estimated at $18 to $20 billion. I, like maybe many of the rest of you, remember this story, and I also remember my reaction, which was maybe like yours. Wait a minute, a city can just file for bankruptcy? And well, it does that when it goes bankrupt. And as we'll learn, a city goes bankrupt in many of the same ways that a person or a business goes bankrupt. Roughly speaking, they run out of money. We are an economics podcast now, if you can't tell. But here to discuss, as always, are Nicole Hemmer of Columbia and Kelly Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
All right, so someone rescue me from my very bad economics description of what it means to go bankrupt.
See, Jody, on this day in 2013, everyone in Detroit had to step outside and shout, "I declare bankruptcy" at the same time.
Oh, is that
how
it
it was
works?
official, yeah.
But, I mean, bankruptcy is like, on one hand, a very complicated thing. On the other hand, not that complicated in the sense of it's what happens when you can no longer pay your obligations, and it gives you a chance to basically hit pause and restructure your debt. Mm-hmm. So let's talk about that first part of the equation, which is why Detroit could no longer pay off its debt and why it owed so much money. How did Detroit get into this position? So
Detroit, for a long time, I'm sort of taking a position on this because I was born in Detroit, and I feel like I have a sense of allegiance to Detroit.
So it's your fault.
Yeah, maybe it's our fault because a lot of our family members left, but flight was a big part of this reason for Detroit's decline. If you can recall, Detroit was the 4th largest city, like New York, LA, Chicago, Detroit. I don't think people appreciate like how booming it was as a city in its heyday. But Detroit has a major exodus of residents, which basically plummets its tax revenue. You can't pull taxes from people who aren't there anymore. And of course, a lot of its businesses, like the car and motor industry, are taking their factories outside of the country to Mexico and other places. So where people had these wonderful, well-paying, vibrant jobs, like many of my family members did, when that no longer became the case, Detroit began its slow decline.
Yeah, I mean, this is a story that's not just limited to Detroit. It's the entire state of Michigan that is reeling by the 2000s. The auto industry had been in decline, deindustrialization was taking hold, and so cities like Detroit, like Flint, like Benton Harbor, like all of these places were starting to go bankrupt because they were losing their tax base. They had these obligations to pay pensions. So they had all of this money that they owed and no money coming in. And they were falling further and further and further behind. And as many cuts as they were making, and they were making terrible cuts to necessary services. They were making all of these cuts and they just couldn't get out of that hole. And that's why you end up getting this bankruptcy.
Yeah, just to put some numbers to it, Detroit's population in 1950 at its peak was 1.8 million. By 2013, it was down to 700,000 as Kelly said, it went from the fourth biggest city in the U.S. in the 40s. And the car industry story, I think it's clear that there's a bit of a decimation in the car industry for a number of reasons, and a lot of those jobs go away. A lot of the union, the sort of stability that comes from a good union job gets hollowed out for a lot of reasons. By the mid-2000s or so, the car industry is coming back a little bit if you look at the numbers, but a lot of those plants are not within the Detroit city limits. And to your point, it's just about the tax base. And, it doesn't matter if a plant is a mile outside the city limits, you don't get that revenue.
This is also still, I would say, in a sort of post-2008 collapse moment, so that
Absolutely.
Black and brown people have not gotten the recovery from the housing crisis that a lot of other cities have gotten by this point. And so it made a bad situation even worse when you add the housing crisis on top of that.
Well, these are parts of the same story in a way, because it's a story of suburbanization, which we tend to talk about as a flight of residents, right? A flight of people to these homes out in the suburbs. But these businesses are fleeing as well. And what that does to the tax base. I mean, the housing crisis is happening in the city as well as in the suburbs. But it's just like every time Detroit starts to get back on its feet a little bit, it gets pummeled a little bit more.
Yeah, and it's a reminder that there are, near suburbs of Detroit that remain incredibly wealthy throughout this entire story. And, often those break down along racial lines too, which we can get into. So Detroit declares bankruptcy. Let's talk a little bit about the reaction writ large, and then we can get into the details of how they work their way through this. But I sort of remember it at the time, and maybe even I sort of had a little bit of this in me, but there was a little bit of a well, that's what you expect kind of vibe from, I think, a lot of the country. There was not much protest or sadness or whatever, or eulogizing of what's happened to this great American city. There was kind of this they screwed up and this is what you get kind of vibe.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think that we see this happen a lot when it comes to anything that involves large numbers of Black people, and that people get forgotten. And for a lot of people, this is like an economic Katrina. I mean, if you think about the fact that they felt abandoned by the rest of the country, and that people were sort of like, oh, you're going bankrupt, figures. And then, next news cycle, next news story. So there's a lot of understandable resentment about how Michiganders and Detroiters feel about how the rest of the country feels about them, which is why you get the popular t-shirt Detroit versus everybody. I mean, I think that sort of sentiment gets propelled by the ideas that they are not just a forgotten city, but something that people no longer value as bringing something to the economic table.
Yeah, and remember that in 2008 as well, Mitt Romney writes an op-ed that's called "Let Detroit Go Bankrupt," and he doesn't really pay a price for that, right? It comes up again in the 2012 election as a little blip that sort of underscores the idea that he's a heartless vulture capitalist. But again, there's just not. It's so good to hear you call it economic Katrina, Kelly, because it should have that emotional punch, and it doesn't. It's not freighted with the same kind of political consequences or, narrative about the loss of this great city.
So I think this is also interesting because in the 1970s, a lot of cities across the country are facing economic crisis and hardship because of deindustrialization. And as a result of that, New York City, our largest city, finds itself also, on the brink of economic collapse and bankruptcy. There's the famous Daily News cover that says "Ford to City, drop dead." You can actually Google that headline and see it. When you think about the fact that the president sort of did the same thing that Mitt Romney does, years later. But New York City gets bailed out. New York City gets federal funds to help recover and put itself back on a financial track. But that doesn't happen with Detroit. Detroit has to basically rely on the goodness of philanthropy and other people to pull together to make sure that Detroit stays solvent.
One other element we should mention here is just sort of in the narrative that emerges around Detroit going bankrupt. There was some talk that one of the fears around Detroit going bankrupt was that it would set a precedent for other cities that were in dire economic straits to use bankruptcy as a get out of jail free card or whatever, and put that option on the table. If Detroit did it, we can do it to get out of our obligations. I will just say I find that argument absurd. No one is sitting there wanting to go bankrupt. No one is waiting for the green light to go bankrupt. It's a very hard decision, and it's like this. Yeah, it just seems like a very heartless take that this idea that there's a bunch of cities just chomping at the bit to declare bankruptcy.
Yeah. I think I wholeheartedly agree with that as well. No one wants to be bankrupt. No one wants to be beholden to debtors in that way. Yeah. And no one wants to have things like their pension forfeited and their benefits forfeited. It really does have a spiral effect, and not just an economic impact, but I would dare to say a health impact. People's health plummets when their economic status is insecure. And so it really is this domino effect that ripples all throughout the country when certain elements of the city are not stable.
So I guess that brings us to how Detroit starts to work its way through this. It starts to restructure a lot of its debt. Detroit has plummeting revenues, and we should also say, I think some poor city management, certainly, plummeting revenues. And there are also a lot of its obligations are for basic city services, but also for pensions, for city employees. And, this is one of those interesting moments. Actually, Adam McKay, who was a former guest on this show, and he has this thing where he's like, throughout my entire life, whenever there's this moment, whenever these big moments of national economic crisis, it boggles my mind that all of a sudden everyone decides to get mad at teachers. It's like over and over. It's like the world is collapsing. Let's get mad at teachers, right? And that happens a little bit here because teachers have pensions and people look at those pension obligations and so forth. So we start to get, I think, a fairly classic at this point pitting of pension obligations against other financial considerations, including things like the Detroit Art Museum, and this sort of stew of all these different city interests going up against each other. Nikki, you want to talk a little bit about how that played out?
Yeah, so you have these pensions that people desperately want the money for because they've structured their entire lives around what they're supposed to get for their retirement, but the city just doesn't have the money. And at some point, the idea of taking all of the art at the Detroit Institute of Arts and selling its collection is one way that the city can get all of this money. And then there's kind of a standoff over how this is going to be done because nobody really wants the art just piecemeal sold into private collections, but there are private donors who would love to see more of a public-private partnership than to allow the city to hold on to and to continue to own this art. And so they eventually strike what's known as a grand bargain, probably the most overused term in U.S. politics, where they decide that, okay, we'll make this a public-private partnership where a private institute owns and holds this art, and we're going to give you the money that you would have gotten, at least some of it, if you would have sold this art so that you can meet at least some of your pension obligations. So very rich people get to keep the art, and they also don't have to pay for all of the pensions. So you can figure out who the winners and losers are there.
I mean, I don't think we realize just how much bankruptcy has an impact on the ground, so that if you're living in Detroit, there are streetlights that aren't working. There's a possibility that you could have worked in a job for 20, sometimes 30 plus years and not have anything to show for, or maybe have a third of your pension to show for as a result of your city's inability to pay. So these aren't just sort of like metaphorical ideas about what could happen if the lights get shut off. The lights were getting shut off, and people were up against a real wall in terms of what was going to take place next.
And I think it comes down to a big debate about the social contract, right? Like, what does a government, whether it's the city, whether it's the state, whether it's the federal government, which has lots of money, what does it owe to its citizens? Because if you don't have streetlights, you're going to see a rise in injuries. You're going to see a rise in crime. If you don't pay off these pensions, you are going to plummet so many people into poverty in their old age, the very thing that something like Medicare was created to prevent from happening. And so you make these promises to people because you want society to look a certain way. And what does it mean to default on those obligations? Who owes what to whom is what's at the heart of this.
Yeah. So Detroit does start to slowly work its way through this bankruptcy process. It sheds about $7 billion in debt, restructures another $3 billion. It eliminated almost $8 billion in payments to retired workers and then got off the hook for another $4 billion or so for healthcare obligations. It's a little hard for me to tell. I think that the pension cuts were not as bad as a lot of people feared. And I think overall, like, the restructuring did provide a path for Detroit to work its way through this. A 2.2% annual cost of living reduction in a pension, has an impact. And so, I think a lot of retirees in Detroit are still feeling that. But ultimately, I feel like one of the things that started to bring Detroit out of this was really just a revitalization of the city itself. And, going back to the simple fact of, like, there's two sides of the equation. There's what you owe, but then there's also what you make. And as more people come into the city, the tax revenue increases. And that really seems to have been the thing that has provided Detroit a path forward.
I do think, and I hope, very much hope, that Detroit in the next 20 years will look like a completely different city, that people will come back, that people will invest, that people will want to take their businesses there. I mean, it's insanely affordable when you think about
affordable.
The coast and where you could live and what kind of house you could have. A beautiful brick home in Michigan or in Detroit. I mean, there's so much there.
Yeah, and what it looks like when people are unhooked from location as part of their work. I mean, that is the next big restructuring that's going to happen, and Detroit might just be the place to hang up your Zoom window for the foreseeable future.
All right, well, that brings us to the end of the episode. Nicole Hammer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kelly Carter-Jackson, thanks to you. And I gather from just what I've heard over the course of this episode, as soon as we're done recording, you're going to call up your family and convince everyone to move back to Detroit?
Sure, yeah.
Sure.
I still have cousins there, so yeah, maybe.
All right. Well, thank you for doing this.
My pleasure.
This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX, a network of independent, listener-supported, artist-owned podcasts. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. You can get in touch with us with any questions or comments or ideas for the show. Email us thisdaypod@gmail.com, or you can find a form at thisdaypod.com. My name is Jody Avirgan. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon. So let me tell you what happened when I got my box of seafood from Blue Circle Foods. I immediately gave the frozen salmon in there my official, patented, how fresh is this fish treatment, which is really just to cook it in an incredibly simple way. Oven, 475, a little olive oil, salt, pepper, lemon, maybe some herbs. And guess what? This passed with flying colors. Incredibly fresh, incredibly delicious salmon delivered right to my door. And that is basically what Blue Circle Foods is all about. There's salmon fillets, shrimp, frozen bites for kids, smoked salmon. You choose the schedule, the portions. You will become a seafood lover. Use the code THISDAY10 at bluecirclefoods.com for $10 off your first box. If you give it a shot, email me. I'll send you that salmon recipe. Once again, that's THISDAY10 at bluecirclefoods.com.
Radiotopia.